All right, so welcome to SaltConf15. It's been a good day so far, all right? Everybody enjoying themselves? Yeah. Yeah. So in this session, we're going to take a look at how I was able to turn things around for a struggling educational nonprofit and learn how to manage all the things in the process. Or in other words, SaltStack and how it relates to horses. But first, let's talk about me. So, I've had the pleasure of working with horses over a number of years now. Yes, you can tell, right? But I was doing things like training for therapeutic riding programs, as well as dressage, so running after fancy horses for rich people. There is a lot we can learn from that animal. It's a special, special thing. And being a cowboy is good, honest, and hard work. Plus, it's a ton of fun. I am a developer. I make websites, apps, and security tools to make life easier for other people. I do back-end and front-end work, and I'm obsessive about performance and reliability. But if you don't make it usable and pretty, nobody's going to use it anyway. So I've worked in a wide variety of languages like Python, C, even machine code and assembly. But being able to loop in operations and other key stakeholders from the very beginning has always been a cornerstone of success for any of my projects. And it's been great to have a DevOps perspective for building out products and solutions, for networking, and for delivering support for business requirements. I'm also a former IT director in the nonprofit educational sector. I was pretty lucky that my experience provided the insight I needed to actually be able to define the support for our business requirements and develop a sustainable rapid delivery cycle for all of our solutions. It was my job to make sure that everyone and everything had what they needed to work efficiently, and to ensure that nothing IT-related interrupted or impeded the learning environment. So this little school was pretty special to me. It was near and dear to my heart, and it was a huge part of where I grew up. The city I called home has frequently been listed in the top 10 poorest cities in the nation. I love it, but it's dirt poor. So we tried our hardest every day to offer technical training and vocational rehabilitation opportunities to anyone that needed it, spanning 33 areas of industry and all taught by local industry leaders. So with that, our students were still more than likely to be the very first in their families to ever graduate high school or come close, let alone considering a professional career and continuing their education. But pretty soon I realized a trend, that every day, everything needed security, whether I was dealing with customer data, student data, or business assets. I was always running into things that needed security wrappers and protection. And I eventually just decided that security was way cooler. So I moved from the rolling hills of the Appalachians to being surrounded by the distant peaks of the Rockies. Now my background is pretty varied. It's been a heck of a ride so far. I've been able to learn how to work hard, to deliver solid products. I've learned the importance of balanced management and of keeping your people safe. Aside from that, there still tends to be some confusion between the connection about these last three titles and an equestrian enthusiast. They're all actually pretty closely related, and I can explain the link in a few words. They all work hard, and they see all the manure. But now that I've got better tools, shoveling that manure is a whole lot easier. So I've been a heavy salt user myself for the better part of 4 years now. It can be a fantastic tool and an even better framework. And I've seen it do some amazing things, but we needed something amazing. So there are a couple of you from an education background, right? Well, working in the nonprofit educational sector, I'm sure you understand that resources can be extremely limited. So I walked into a pretty nasty situation where almost everything IT related needed to be rebuilt. I had high expectations and high demands, but a very, very small window to actually get things done. And I was the only one there to start with. So in the midst of their world collapsing, I didn't have time to fiddle around with different products and consoles. I needed a single pane of glass for management for all of our services. And whatever we ended up with absolutely had to be quickly deployed and integrated, easily used and maintained, and carrying minimal technical debt. But it's just a little school, right? I mean, they can't have all that much to take care of, right? Well, almost 300 servers later, we've got a good collection of RHEL 6 and 7, and running the gamut with legacy LTS, CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, and even some old FreeBSD thrown in there for good measure. And the vast majority of our virtual machines were Windows servers in 2003, 2008, and 2012. We had some dirty old Mac X servers thrown in, some rack mount minis in the closets too, just for kicks. And we needed to manage our hypervisors spread across Xen, KVM, and VMware. We also had a decent smattering of containerized apps in LXC and Docker containers, but not to mention our storage boxes for that fiber channel SAN and our campus-wide NAS. We desperately needed something quick, lightweight, and flexible enough to fit our demands. I was also the network engineer, which meant I didn't have a whole lot of time to actually go around and administer all of our appliances. So hooking into edge switches, APs, core routers, core switching and routers, our firewalls, and our load balancers was an absolute necessity. I mentioned we had high demands. Well, fortunately for us, we were actually replacing almost everything network side. So my choice of architecture directly defined what third-party management tools we could actually consider implementing and actually go ahead and do that. But not only did we need to avoid technical debt, but financial debt too. There was no chance of anything remotely cost prohibitive. Before I came in, they were in the middle of a complete data loss scenario and didn't even know it. Their entire infrastructure was on the brink of collapse from dilapidation, neglect, and environmental nightmares. Everything, all of our products, all of our services, all of our solutions were end of sale, end of life, with expired service contracts on everything. There was literally rust building up on the racks and the chassis in some of our data centers. Yeah, seriously. So, and the worst rust buildup was on our new SAN and our backup cluster, the only on-site backup cluster. So there were a lot of problems. And our switching closets frequently lost ventilation and environmental controls, which led to our network literally suffocating from the heat. All of this led to a complete rip and replace. We had to gut each data center and switching closet. Networks, SAN, servers, everything. Even our main UPS had given up the ghost. Well, the wide impact of this cautionary tale for disaster recovery planning also meant that while we could totally go ahead and blow our entire budget for the year on just taking care of the bare essentials, I would still end up being the only one left to install and configure everything. Support contracts? Maybe. Professional services? No way for this fiscal year. And they had a hard enough time swallowing that bill. But it also meant that I was left with next to nothing for actually managing everything and for training new staff. Well, the first business case was actually pretty simple. We started out with an ordinary flat SaltStack deploy, with one master in the backbone, handling the care and feeding of our VMs, the hardware, new deploys, and our switching and firewalls. We leveraged Salt SSH and proxy minions out the wazoo to hook into our switching and firewalls, which turned out to be a pretty slick solution for us. And for a number of our cloud services, we still had to roll our own modules to hook into their APIs. But by the end of it, heck, we could even manage that smart toaster the faculty's been begging for. But we actually managed to deploy all of these services through Salt in pretty short order. Even in the middle of recovering from a catastrophic failure like this, we'd achieved complete data center automation and management in less than 2 months. And everything was moving pretty smoothly until I realized something. I had only managed to automate 10% of my environment, which made our next business case much more interesting, albeit slightly less defined. So I wasn't just responsible for the data center, and the data center wasn't the only thing in trouble. We had students using outdated software and hardware if they had anything to work with. Our classrooms didn't have the technology support they needed. I mean, there were technology classes without functional computers, and no way to know who has what, who needs help with what devices, and where they might be now. But it was time to move things forward. You know, there is no reason why students today should have to handle a 5¼ inch floppy disk to do their work. It's embarrassing. So we started rolling out new hardware, standardizing and centralizing our services. SaltStack helped us to deploy everything from the data center to the classroom. The transition was pretty seamless. All right, well, almost seamless. Let's talk about end user devices. So the original scope for this point focused on Windows 8, Windows 7, Vista, XP, and unfortunately even some Windows 2000 boxes. We also had a fair number of Macs in the building, ranging from OS X 10.2 through 10.8. And in an effort to standardize some of our services, we also rolled out some thin clients. We had a couple of pallets of thin clients sitting on our loading bay that all needed the same degree of management without the benefits of a proprietary management console. And we almost officially supported Linux in CentOS and Ubuntu. I don't know if any of you actually knew this already, but end users are weird, right? They do strange things and they break things frequently. With that said, we still needed to automatically administer all of these devices from one endpoint and make sure that it was reliable and sustainable. This added many more devices to the mix that didn't quite fit our standard setup, with more stringent monitoring requirements. And not too surprising, once we started turning things on, our single master started getting hammered non-stop. And let's take on mobile devices too while we're at it, right? Android and iOS, on campus and off, all needed the same level of monitoring and remote maintenance. That meant that including these devices, approximately 40% of our end user devices could be off campus at any given moment. Now luckily, our MDM APIs were pretty accommodating for Android and iOS. And that gave us the same degree of ease of management through Salt as every other device in my network, with some added perks too, like geo-tracking and fencing for different users. Well, that's great and all, but this still only took care of a portion of these issues, and performance was absolutely terrible. From everything we could find, it looked like scaling up was the only thing to try. So we scaled up. We had one massive box, 16 cores and 32 gigs of RAM as our one dedicated master. It was ugly and massively irritating. The thing was a nightmare and a headache every day. When we started, there were limited documentation on load balancing, and the outlook for docs on high availability was even worse. And this whole time, our single master was still getting a denial of service on a regular basis. We quickly realized that one master just was not going to cut it. So there were a number of suggestions to solve this, some from Salt and some from the community. But most involved complicating the setup with grouped and tiered masters and downstream syndics. Now, I don't know how many of you are already using Salt, right? Show of hands. Well, I did not want masters for every VLAN, device type, or role. I mean, you understand the effort involved in managing one master? It's not that bad when you come from a chef or a puppet background, right? But it's ridiculous to do this. And that does not seem appropriate. And I felt like it wasn't too hard of a thing to ask. I just needed fast, reliable connections with bonus points for failover and redundancy. This had to be scalable and accessible from inside and outside of our network while still being security conscious. So, a high-level overview of what we ended up with. 4 lightweight masters, 1 server with 1 core and 512 mega RAM, and 3 servers with 2 cores and 2 gigs of RAM. That's a huge difference. But we were only balancing across these last 3 masters. We also introduced some access controls with group-based module rights and a logical separation defining what our sysadmins can and cannot touch. We also used Git integration pretty heavily for managing our configs and API hooks. And we packaged some custom returners to take the load off of our masters. Now, I know what you're all thinking at this point, but how does this relate to horses? So, horses like to live in good-sized communities. They have a well-established social hierarchy. There's always a lead horse, even if it's the only horse. They need social interactions. And if you've ever had a chance to work with horses, they will try to talk to anything they think might be capable of a response, even a fence post. And they talk constantly. The worst part is, the lead horse hears everything, whether it likes it or not. Now, not far from my hometown, there are these 2 little islands. And without getting into how this happened, there's almost always been a herd of Spanish ponies squatting there. So that's actually the island. That's Assateague Island. Now, there are over 300 horses on these 2 little islands, surrounded by pine trees, beautiful beaches, bitter cold Atlantic water, and swarms of bugs with an unquenchable bloodlust all year long. But that's the East Coast. Now, 300 horses might not sound all that bad, right? But when you think about the fact that is more than 450,000 pounds of hair and muscle eyeing up your campsite, it's time to hang on to your Pop-Tarts. The thing is, if you're not prepared to accommodate for that many horses, you are going to run into problems. And minions are just the same. They have a well-defined social hierarchy. There's always a master, even with masterless. They need that social interaction with the master, and depending on your jobs and returners, they could be talking constantly. And your master hears everything, whether it needs to or not. And balancing auths, reauths, and reconnects were always a problem. A couple thousand minions doesn't sound all that bad. But for us, that turned into an average of more than 50,000 concurrent connections. Our master was getting pummeled nonstop, with all of our minions responding frequently, and more often than not, all at once. But at the same time, the more we used Salt to manage all of our resources, the more we liked it. But with return-heavy and time-sensitive jobs, we started losing visibility as we expanded, and we did keep expanding. So we eventually reached a point where it was no longer feasible, cost or time effective to keep adding resources to our master. I mean, how do you deal with that, right? And it's so mind-boggling. But if you've ever seen an old Western film, thundering herds like this can be a huge problem. So let's prevent it from the very beginning. Horses are pretty smart. I mentioned they have a well-defined social hierarchy, not an equestrian autocracy. There are often multiple lead horses working almost in parallel to support each other and the herd. And then they can also delegate to other horses downstream. They balance the load. We needed a way to step back from the traditional SaltStack topology and to do something unusual. It's an enterprise product, and I'm going to manage and balance it like one. Well, once we were able to successfully prove out the functionality of Salt in our environment, we plan to add a large number of additional minions to the cluster. And without planning for scale, even while starting out smaller, migrating to a larger deploy can get very complicated very quickly. It's been my experience that Salt users tend to adopt a more Pythonic way of doing things, accepting complex versus complicated. It just seemed so counterintuitive to have to backtrack like that. And jerry-rigging with break fixes doesn't solve anything. A lead horse gets to that position for a reason. They know how to collaborate and communicate. And before you go ahead and get yourself in a pinch, you need to let somebody know. If one of your masters is unable to cope or respond to the load, the other masters had better already know about it and be ready to take on some of those jobs. It's important to configure your masters so that the con cache is synced and your load monitoring can direct your minions to the right master. And Salt is great for coordination of efforts, but does your master really need to handle that return? Probably not. I mean, when you're building out your jobs, absolutely. Go ahead and give your master a heads up that you received it and you finished it, but your master might not be the one benefiting from more verbose data. So don't send it there. Using selective returners for the things that don't matter to your SaltStack instance will save you from that inevitable headache. So let's take a look at what we ended up with. Yeah, mind blown, right? Well, you see, it's not actually that difficult. But let me explain a bit on this. Master 0 up there is what I call our master-master. Now, from the master-master's perspective, this is honestly how simply it sees things. The dotted lines represent connections available to each device. Master 0's minions are only accessible through Salt. We also can only connect to the master-master through restricted SSH. And our code was automatically synced once our Git repos were merged to production. But why do we have a master-master? I mean, why that added layer of complexity? Because it's not actually that simple. The master-master's minions are actually our production masters. And production masters don't know they're minions, and the master-master doesn't know that its minions are masters. The master-master also served to create a logical isolation between our production masters and our sysadmins. Taking the human interaction and error out of the equation means that we can successfully automate that much more. The master also handled cert generation and distribution because right now, all certs must be identical across all production masters. I know, it's an awful design and security practice, but it's unavoidable for now. It also handles distributing and pushing production master and downstream minion configs, delivery and synchronization of modules, load monitoring, and dynamic production master scaling. Now, as I mentioned, there is absolutely no human interaction permitted directly with the production masters. All changes must be processed through our Git-based approval workflow. Production masters can also communicate. The minion cache is synced across all production masters automatically. And the load is visible across all masters. That way we get all the benefits of configuration management and managing our configuration management tools. And then we told our minions to be quiet. Simple statuses, successes, and small job results are returned to the production masters, while any complex job data is shipped directly to specific endpoints, like our Redis engine, fronting an elk stack for most of what we needed. In our case, if builds or other jobs failed, our elk stack would create an issue and an automatic pull request in the offending Git branch, alerting the Salt admins to go and fix it through the usual approval workflow, starting the process over from the beginning. That solves most of our problems, right? Well, kind of. And that brings us to our next point. Horses are mobile. They've got legs. They need to move, run around, do horse things, right? They like to exercise and work hard. And they go places you wouldn't expect or rightly want them to. Back to those two little islands, every year they do what's called a pony swim. Each year they go out and round up about 150 of these horses, have them swim across a narrow channel between the islands and the mainland. It's about 1,000 feet, give or take. Then they go ahead and auction off about 50 to 60 of them to keep the population manageable. But the really neat thing is that these auctions are frequented by international buyers. These Assateague Island and Chincoteague Island ponies are highly prized. But all of a sudden, those little island ponies are spread out worldwide. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could just open the door and let some of our users walk out? Well, unfortunately, you can't. Your users are your users. They will be mobile, and you need to be prepared. So now, our production masters live partially in the DMZ, thanks to a stateful firewall and WAF that handled much of the security wrappers and protection needed to do this. And our minions are inside and out, which posed a number of other problems. All traffic inbound to our external network was heavily filtered through another firewall. If we pushed everything through our external VIPs, we'd just be fighting with another bottleneck. We really did not want to run everything through our VPN concentrator either. I didn't want to have to sink more resources into that than necessary. But Salt minions have a neat little feature that's super easy to use: master failover. A master failover allowed us to define which master, internal or external, each minion would try first. Now, taking that and running with it, we also had a custom Python daemon that monitored these connections. Depending on the frequency it was on or off campus, it would be added to a group that indicated the most appropriate master. Our Redis engine was already in the DMZ for other reasons, so that same job that would update the default master pointed to our internal or external Redis engine in the same calls. But one quick caveat with user devices outside of your campus: you have to accept that some things are going to wander off. And there is no excuse not to use a solid MDM with enforced profiles. Just be sure to supplement with salt to harass it into shape. We had some devices that needed to report more frequently, but had the possibility of being behind a more restrictive firewall outside of our control. In those cases, our MDM agent triggered a high state from a local SALT call, which kickstarted a targeted VPN client that rerouted all of our SALT traffic straight back to home base. That's awesome, right? But that wasn't the end for us. We needed to do more, which leads us to my final point. Horses are crafty. They're smart. They're creative, and they will do almost anything it takes to get what they want. But think about those two little islands. Horses on the beach. That's pretty much awesome. I mean, they're swimming in the ocean, horses chilling out around campfires, peeking into your tent and sitting on your car. And pretty soon you realize you can't go anywhere, and they've eaten all your food. Well, humans are pretty crafty too. Maybe not always the cleverest, but they will still do almost anything it takes to get what they think they want. They do things you might not expect, and they cause systems to do the same. Now, your use cases may vary, and your business drivers and objectives could change, but once you open that door, it's awful hard to close it. You need to think long and hard about what's best for your organization now and in the future before trying to roll out anything like this. Now, I didn't start off with the idea of making a better MDM. We started with firefighting and taking care of emergencies in the best way we knew how. But on the flip side, doing things like this also tends to show your stakeholders some unusual possibilities. Inviting fringe cases for SaltStack outside of saving your bacon on a daily basis. Now, there were a number of things that pushed me into the difficult position of building as opposed to buying. Playing the political game, we had to tread very, very carefully. I mentioned there was an urgent need for cleanup and recovery. It really was that bad. As the IT director, I needed to make the best choice for the organization. And not necessarily the easiest one for me, and certainly not one that would paint us into a corner. And what we were looking at started with 2 double-faulted RAID 5 arrays in our SAN, with faulty or non-existent backups, antiquated and recalled networking equipment, even our fiber channel switches. We also had licensing issues and all the fun that comes along with that. And our main data center was cooked at ambient temperatures of officially over 99 degrees Fahrenheit, repeatedly until our main storage cluster and our core hypervisor clusters were rendered useless. I also say officially 99 degrees Fahrenheit, only because that's how high our thermostat could go. A slightly less than official meat thermometer jammed in the racks clocked in at over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a very hot day. But we had 1 month to get back up and running before students were once again wandering our halls. With no existing management solutions in-house, dated and inaccurate records, and at the time, still only me available to fix things, I did not have a lot of options. There was only one way I could see us recovering in time. And if it didn't work, I'd essentially be responsible for destroying the only chance some of our students had at a decent education. Being excited about learning, having a chance to be the very first in their family to do anything like that. Failure was never an option. And so I got started. After sourcing the hardware, I initially began the cleanup effort with an with an odd combination of Chef, Surf, and vulnerability scanning tools, also integrating with our APs and edge switches to collect a more authoritative inventory. But once that was finished, I knew SaltStack was a cleaner, more platform-agnostic choice for our environment and our somewhat peculiar needs. So I used Chef to deploy our Salt minions, and I used Salt to get rid of the traces of my messy kitchen. I mean, no more stuffing cookbooks into the Burke shelf. But after using Salt to deploy and configure our remaining physical hosts and hypervisors, I quickly wrote modules for our hypervisors and began deploying and configuring our mission-critical servers. Now, Salt modules are dead simple. You can write them in less than 10 lines of code. The modules that I wrote to hook into our hypervisors were less than 50 each. And it took me 30 minutes once I realized what I needed to do. It's not that hard, and I invite all of you to be able to join in and do that. But from the ground up, it was less than one day to have 3 Active Directory servers live, configured, hardened, and all of our student accounts pulled and recreated. By the end of the first week, we had all of our networking equipment connected and baselined through Salt, including our routers, which could be automatically updated through our software-defined networking setup. And our baseline configs and alerts and standard returners were applied to all of our recently provisioned 60 mission-critical servers. But finishing up the nightmare of this unplanned disaster recovery exercise, well within our timeline, also gave the school a chance to see what else they could be doing better. For us, the benefit outweighed the risks, but some of the things we ended up doing should only ever be your very last resort. It's important to never lose sight of what's best for your organization, not just what sounds really cool right now. With that said, aside from the odd things we've already gone over and some basic config management, like policy enforcement, remote universal deploys, and system and service configuration, we also ended up branching out into a few different areas. In addition to our usual configs, we also kicked off some special jobs that performed integrity checks on all of our backups across all 3 of our endpoints, each with different storage backends. And we spent a fair amount of effort in developing and fleshing out more advanced alerting and reporting, with dashboards to offer a more heads-up style view to our board. Device ownership and asset management also became a vital part of our Salt services. Then we included some targeted software and licensing auditing, some device configuration auditing, and even some rudimentary anomaly detection using Yara. Then in preparation for the next year of students, our LDAP integration for account and desktop provisioning was added to the list, and our MDM APIs received some well-deserved attention. Now, admittedly, a number of the snags we hit along the way should be cleared up for the most part with the introduction of RAID, if you can use all Linux. As far as I understand, it's still not for Windows, so it's not all that helpful for me. And the new HTTP API module. I mean, seriously, where was that 3 years ago? Now, I loved what Salt did for me, and I loved even more what it could do for the school. My goal was always to make sure that the effort was sustainable. I wanted to ensure that remote management of pretty much everything was possible from one endpoint. SaltStack worked great, and it fit all of our needs. And I could easily take care of our end-user desktops, laptops, servers, switches. I could toggle the status of PoE. I could manage our UPS, and if the building and grounds supervisor would have let me, even the HVAC system from an iPad or a Chromebook. But I know what Salt's done for me. I know what I want to do with it, but I'm here to learn from you guys. I'm here to help support and to be a part of this community. So let's open it up to questions. Comments? Songs of praise and adoration?
Well, I believe I'm considered an end user, so I just want to say you've made me feel like a rock star.
Well, sorry about that. No, really, my students were fantastic. They were great, and they understood more of this than I did. So we actually had some of our students working in the help desk, which made my life so much easier, because then we didn't have to hire anybody to take care of it either. But everything that I've done has been driven by suggestions and thoughts provided by our end users. So, go ahead.
So, on the mobile thing is
Yeah.
really intriguing because before I worked for SaltStack. So before I started working for SaltStack, I worked in an organization where we did MDM. So did you just interface with the MDM Solutions APIs and then issue calls to those APIs to go to be functional on the device? Is that what you guys?
So I mentioned the HTTP API module. We actually built our own, but unfortunately, because it was an educational institution, we couldn't release the code legally. Otherwise, that would have been a fun thing to roll out.
Can you repeat what the question was?
So he asked how we were interfacing with our mobile devices, whether through API calls to the MDM or interfacing directly to the client. Is that right? Yeah. So we had some unusual agreements with our MDM provider, which also happened to be the provider for our networking equipment. They had recently stripped out the API for end users for their enterprise customers. But in this case, they were willing to let us open it up so that we could pull data directly from the device. So their API functioned more or less as a Salt agent for us. We didn't use it in any other fashion. Does that answer it? Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
You said you've been working with SaltStack for 4 years, and Thomas Hatch invented it in February 2011.
Yeah, it's just the better part of 4 years. So since it's been published.
So
Yeah.
you were right there when he started.
Yeah, it's been fun. They've grown a lot in the past 4 years, but yeah.
Also, you mentioned, because it goes back to my background, and so you mentioned that you were using Salt from an asset management, assigning ownership, that kind of. Can you expound a little bit on what you did there? Did you publish to a CMDB?
Yeah. So we had originally been using UCMDB, HP's product, but that wasn't an option for us to continue because of licensing and just the overall cost. So one of the things that we did was we had a SQL database set up with a custom returner, so that every time we provisioned a box, it would define a grain on that box explicitly for that user. And as other users rotated and the main use of that box was transitioned to another user, it would flag it and then notify us saying that it needed to be updated, and it would also update the database. So the custom UCMDB without the DDMI agent. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it's interesting that you have been a part of using SaltStack since really its inception, since it was released. Would you, what's your opinion on the growth, like in the past year and a half? Do you feel like it's grown more than it did in the first 2 or 3 years combined, or how do you view just that cycle of the last 4 years?
So how do I view the growth of SaltStack in the past year?
Yeah, like in comparison to, because
In comparison to other products in the market, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Rex, you know, it's astronomical. I mean, it seems like the development and the community base is growing at a rapid pace. Now, if it were my own project, I'd be concerned that it's a bubble, but having used the product and continuing to use the product in another role in a different company, you know, I plan very much on betting on that horse, you know. I mean, it's.
I think a thing to me is there's other products that you
Yeah.
make that are products, but this thing feels like a movement to me.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean,
feels like Linux.
it's a way of doing things. It's a framework for doing work better. So, anything else? Yeah.
So you had 2 months from the end of the school session
Yeah.
to when school started to get all this done. You couldn't have done all the work yourselves. Did you hire contractors to lay Cat 6 and all that, or what?
No. I had been doing 16-hour days, 6 days a week.
Do you have any student volunteers, or?
It was off term, so we couldn't. Yeah, we had some maintenance staff that handled running some of the fiber lines in the Cat 6, but other than that, racking and stacking, everything was me, and eventually one other guy to start. Everybody else came on after the fact. Yeah. So I'd like to close and asking you all a question that was once asked to me. How cowboy are you? I mean, you could be 10% or 100%. We started with 10%, but I knew it could be better. Now, I get things done quickly and reliably using flexible tools and frameworks. But let me tell you, my answer then and my answer now will always be the same. How about you? All right.